I think open source is one of these seeds that's kind of growing within the beast, so to speak, where it organically appears and it wants to be born. Takes us beyond the competitiveness of our current system.
Welcome to Entangled Futures with Lucas Tawil, where we explore mutuality and conversations towards a world that works for everyone.
This episode is brought to you by the Holochain Foundation. Holochain is creating technology that allows people to team up, share information, and solve their own problems without needing a middleman. Creating carriers that cannot be captured, Holochain enables privacy and holds space for innovation and mutuality. I first came across the project in 2018 during my journey into participative culture with Unspiral. My good friend Haley Cooper-Ryder pointed me to the green paper, and I was blown away by the vision of a local-first, decentralized internet. I worked for 5 years on the project and feel very grateful for the support with the show. Enjoy it. Today we welcome Lynn Foster, a champion of open source software and co-author of the Value Flows vocabulary. The Value Flows vocabulary is designed to represent economic activities, particularly within distributed fractal networks involving diverse agents, such as individuals, organizations, and ecological entities. The purpose of Value Flows is to enable interoperability across various software projects, serving as a shared vocabulary. Lynn Foster is also a driving force at hREA, an implementation of the Value Flows specification. hREA enables a transparent and trusted account of resources and information flows between decentralized and independent agents across and within ecosystems. Welcome, Lynn. Such a pleasure to have you here.
Oh, my pleasure, Lucas.
Lynn, for us to break the ice, could you share the origins of your journey in open source software?
Sure. So I worked in corporate America in software development for most of my kind of day job career. A little teeny bit of which was open source, but even that was usually kind of open source washing. But when I retired and joined my partner, Bob Haugen, to work on economic open source software, we knew we wanted to help build a commons of shared code to get beyond the corporate scene that's doing so much harm to the earth, to the people, and especially to support people doing economic experiments on the ground. But actually, in those days when we were coding, not a lot of people came around to help, and we weren't really focused on building open source communities at that point. But I want to mention a kind of a little tidbit of a small incident that was kind of my first aha moment about open source, which is maybe 3 weeks into the Value Flows project. Somebody, I don't know, put out some kind of a call, and all of a sudden this graphics designer showed up, made us a logo. Nobody knew this person, Elio. And that was just cool. That was really cool. People just want to contribute what they believe in and contribute what they can. I think open source is one of these seeds that's kind of growing within the beast, so to speak, where it organically appears and it wants to be born. Takes us beyond the competitiveness of our current system.
Lynn, I noticed you differentiating between open source software building and building open source community. Could you expand on that?
Well, open source software is software that lives in the commons and people can use it. They can fork it, they can change it, whatever. An open source community needs to develop around open source software. And we had that in Value Flows. There were a lot of people working on it, people coming in and out, people that cared deeply about it. There was a lot of give and take between people. And that was a completely different experience than me and Bob sitting there coding together, which was also pretty great. But the community is important.
And Lynn, how did the Value Flows initiative start? What was the initial drive?
Yeah, so Value Flows got going around 2015, and for a year before that, maybe there were a bunch of software developers kind of all over the world who were starting to be interested in making software that wasn't just your kind of big walled silo, centralized kinds of things. And there was a lot of ferment going on, and people were talking to each other about how to move forward on making better open source software. One thing that evolved was called the open app ecosystem, and I think that was named by somebody in Inspiral out in your part of the world, which is basically building apps or components that could be built into suites that people, working on the ground can use and that could communicate with each other and be building blocks like Legos or something. And one thing that became clear is that if we had these smaller pieces of software, we were going to need vocabularies and protocols, or vocabularies could be called ontologies, to enable that communication. So that way, like, developers could program in whatever language they liked, they could create very specific things for user groups, etc., and it would be much easier to get the software to interoperate. Otherwise things are geometric. If you have everybody has a different API and you have 600 APIs, it's impractical to connect that way. But if you can say, okay, everybody's using this protocol or this ontology or whatever, then it's really easy. You create that, and then you can suddenly plug into lots of places.
I see, I see. And how did the open app ecosystem evolve?
So it was all this discussion and ferment that was going on then. And then what happened is that as people talked about vocabularies and ontologies, value flows came out of that. We were interested in economic vocabularies. A lot of other people were too. And so Value Flows was born, and a whole bunch of people just went off to work on it.
Wow, 2015. So this is 10
2015.
years on the
Yeah.
ground.
Yes, it is.
It's beautiful. That's
I hate to say,
beautiful.
but yes, it is.
Lynn, you have been in the world of distributed software and gossip protocols for over a decade, right? What patterns have you noticed, and where do you most see potential opportunities?
Let's see. Have you heard of Conway's law, Lucas? You probably have, and it has sort of a lot of permutations. But the one I'm thinking about is roughly that organizational communication structures tend to mirror the technology that's being created by that organization or for that organization without kind of taking a position on what causes what. So these days you can kind of see it evolving, the gig economy, the so-called sharing economy, growth of complex supply chains, that kind of thing. We seem to be moving towards more networked, more distributed organizations. And that finds reflection in software architectures. So there are more distributed software architectures and decentralized architectures appearing. And I think that those kinds of architectures will best support the kind of networked economic organizations we expect to see more of in the future.
Beautiful, beautiful. Yeah, my career as a journalist in technology started on the late 90s, where ERP
Ah,
software were picking up in there was all the year 2000 bug fear in the foundation of ERP software is proprietary, right, and centralized.
yes.
How is this an obstacle for supply chain integration, for example?
So, yes, I remember that period pretty well, actually. Um, Supply chains are, by definition, more, they're not enterprise, right? There are many enterprises involved in a supply chain, um, or whatever form of organization you'd like to plug in there. It's all the same. So being able to use open source software and in some cases even open data, uh, all of which can be seen by people all along the supply chain, makes it easier. You know, your people are like people who work in supply chains tend to work across companies directly with their counterpart, you know, and they're just thinking about making things work. They're not thinking about proprietary this, centralized that, right? So having software that can interoperate or is the same software, whichever, which is still a lofty goal, but sort of automatically supports more informed coordination. And it also means that there has to be a level of trust involved, you know. And I've heard people say that at some point around that time, it became apparent to a lot of people that the best company didn't win anymore. It was the best supply chain that wins. And I'm not interested in winning, but anyway, within that context, that made sense. So even within the capitalist world, that consciousness was developing.
Yeah, it's this shift of take mine into grow ours, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Yeah,
And it works better,
it
shockingly.
does. It does. It does. I love this concept of increasing surface area rather than fighting for the resources on this single surface. So when we start looking at like, well, yeah, this surface is taken, but can we have other surfaces where we don't have to compete and we expand what's possible? This is a huge orientation on the thinking around Holochain and what inspired Art and Eric, and it really speaks to me.
I totally agree with you, and also think that what you're talking about there with the surface area is so much more productive than competition. It's
Yeah,
huge.
it is. Yeah, and it speaks of fractality, doesn't it? There's this shape that emerges that is organic and somehow mimics what we see ecosystems creating in the natural world. Yeah, it resonates with what I feel we should be focusing on, and I think it is, right. It's the space we're playing in.
Yes.
And Lynn, in that regard, what is REA accounting, this space that hREA comes from?
So REA is an ontology which developed initially in academia and was started by a guy named Bill McCarthy at Michigan State University in the US, probably 1980-ish. And there's now kind of a global academic community that revolves around that's active. REA stands for Resources, Events, Agents. And it was actually during that period, it was coming to the forefront of computers and especially database design that enabled this to happen. You know, accounting for a few centuries had been double entry accounting, and McCarthy was able to take that and distill it into a very simple, elegant model based on real economic events that happen in the real world, right? And you can take that kind of data and use it to generate your standard accounting reports, for example, if that's the way you want to look at your economic activity, and that's not a problem. Um, and that's again because of computers, that you can slice and dice and aggregate data how you want. My partner Bob Haugen found REA in the 90s actually when he was looking for a model for a new kind of ERP system. And he needed ERP to go across enterprises. So he contacted McCarthy and kind of said, do you see what I see? This model can work across enterprises. It doesn't have to care. And McCarthy said, I see it. So they worked together for some years, actually, and expanded REA into this more like independent view, or sometimes it's called the helicopter view, which can easily work across enterprises. And that made it really useful for accounting in networks. And there's now lots of experimentation going on in that area, kind of thinking beyond the capitalist enterprise. And Value Flows, which we mentioned earlier, uses REA. That's the base of its model. Adds a few things to make the resource flows a little easier. There's a few things around the edges that kind of go a little bit beyond standard accounting. So it expands the scope a little bit, but its core base and heart is REA. So network resource planning, or kind of called NRP, was what Sensorica ended up calling some software that Bob and I developed in collaboration with them, maybe 2012 to 2015-ish. So it was pre-Value Flows, but it was definitely REA. And Bob and I had, mostly Bob at that point, I was still doing too much day job work, had been experimenting continuously with REA. And when he retired, he had created several systems around us. There were about 3 or 4 food networks and a timber network. And then along came Sensorica, and they were interested in a lot more functionality. I mean, it was basically more or less an ERP system. I'm going to back up just a little bit for you. ERP was created out of initially MRP, Material Requirements Planning, which was a production planning and inventory system way back when. I ran into it in the early 80s. It had already been around a couple of decades, but that was a flow-oriented system. ERP took MRP and tacked on the rest of the software needed for enterprise financial and economic work. So that's like accounts payable and receivable, those kinds of things. And those things, I don't know, I could say that they were designed more to impede flows than enhance flows. So we had conflict between flow-oriented software and non-flow-oriented software. And also the whole thing got kind of bigger and more tacked together and more expensive and harder to work with, etc. But it ended up being software that was meant to cover an enterprise's needs, basically. Now, enter NRP, right? NRP takes everything back to flows because REA does that. That's how it works. It flows all the way down. So we started working with Sensorica in maybe 2012. Maybe I said that. Sensorica was in Montreal. They have a lab there, but they also worked globally through the magic of the internet with organizing what they call an open value network. And that's a flat organization that kind of organized itself into what they called peer production projects. And they were doing research and development, R&D, and eventually some manufacture of open source hardware, particularly sensors, thus Sensorica. And the open source piece was very important to them. And I think that that's the open source hardware world in general is really super important to where we need to go in this world, because we still need a certain amount of stuff. And anyway, that project was interesting because we were developing software while they were developing their organization and their systems. And so it was very fluid and sometimes a little crazy, but it really showed me the value of working agilely and interactively with user groups on the ground. I think you don't need to do that if there's a very mature, stable system that's already been programmed 3 times before or something. But for anything that's this kind of experimental, it really has to be, it's a give and take, a collaboration between the developers and the people trying to make things work on the ground. And that was kind of interesting and fun. And we called the software a working prototype, and that's what it all was. And we threw away a lot of software in the process, and that was fine.
Nice. Lynn, would you explain the importance of ontologies to a beginner?
Well, ontologies give people a defined language to use when they're talking about things and concepts in a domain so people can understand each other better. And ontologies also define the relationships between these things and concepts. Sometimes we kind of tend to use vocabulary and ontology interchangeably, and there's a lot of overlap and kind of looseness in how people use the words. But one thing ontologies definitely have is these relationships. So besides communications between people, there's communication between software, and that's where it becomes really important. That software, people and the software know what is the same thing as something else, right? So software can count on knowing the meaning of what's coming in and what they're sending out. Another implication of all of that is that when software needs to talk to other software, then ontologies, along with technical protocols, make it so that new software can just plug into software ecosystems. They don't have to look and see, oh my gosh, there's 20 different ways I have to talk to these 20 different pieces of software. If everybody's using value flows or whatever, because they're working in the same domain, it's easy. It's so much easier.
Lynn, what are the key innovations in the REA vocabulary?
Well, mostly I would say that it reflects what really happens in the economic world. And that makes it really a lot simpler than thinking about things like debits and credits, which are a little bit of a more analytical view of things and limited. And especially that's true across networks, because actually my debit is probably your credit or whatever. So if you're just looking at reality, none of that matters. So it's also a very clean configurable model. So like different kinds of organizations can define the specifics of their economic activity as data. The ontology won't limit that. And that's where things called taxonomies come in. It's like people do have to agree that, yes, I'm calling this particular kind of whatever X, and you should call it X2 so that we can communicate. But that's all configurable in REA. So it can support any domains. And also, speaking of simplicity, it has this resource event agents, right? And we have processes in there too, and agreements. But that small, simple pattern happens across 3 layers. So the one we've been talking about mostly, and has the R, the E, and the A, is the what really happened layer. We call it observation. I think McCarthy calls it accountability. And before that, there are 2 layers. One is called scheduling or planning. It has the same basic pattern. So it calls the flow there as a commitment instead of an economic event, but it works the same way. And the layer above that is, we call it the knowledge layer. I think McCarthy might call it the policy layer. And it is where all that configuration happens, as well as recipes, which give you a pretty well-defined pattern of what used to be the bill of materials plus routing information plus whatever all into one place, so you can create your plans easily without redoing the same thing over and over when you have repeatable processes. Anyway, those three layers are basically the same model, right? Which also makes it simple. Another innovation is the flows, right? This is a data model that makes it so your recorded economic data can be assembled into flows based on resources flowing, like an output from a process creates a resource that some or all of that resource might be consumed in another process, etc. And you can, if you have open data, you can see that as far back as it goes, right? As far back as it's recorded. So it creates these flows in sort of a form that technical people sometimes call a directed graph. It supports all this network of flows. And that makes things like tracking back what happened to a resource or where all it came from, or what were the implications of how it was produced, much easier. And this also includes in REA both production and exchange types of flows, and those things can connect. If you produce something and the next thing you do is sell it to somebody, then that all works. It's a really nice model, actually. It's perfect for actually something the EU is trying to do now, which is called digital product passports, where I can't remember what year it's supposed to be implemented. It keeps getting moved out, but basically products coming into the EU will be required at some point to have that digital product passport associated with them, and you should be able to scan your QR code on a product and know exactly how it was created, what's happened to it since, for anything coming into that area.
Yeah, that's fascinating in terms
Yeah.
of allowing people to make informed choices on what they consume and what they are economically supporting, right? Yeah.
Yes.
Fingers crossed it will come soon.
Yes.
Lynn, what about the Holochain architecture? What is different about it?
Okay, I'm going to give you a simple version because I'm not a deep expert in Holochain. But the key thing, and we might have said this before, is that it is actually distributed. That is, a network's data is held on everybody's individual computers, right? There's no central server, which takes a little bit of getting used to. This kind of fits back into our Conway's law discussion. So it supports networks because it is a network, and it handles all that distribution so that you don't, if somebody's offline, you aren't missing any data. It manages sharding that out into the Holochain world using Holochain magic and a distributed hash table. It also has, because of that architecture, it has an emphasis on privacy and security and all of those kinds of things. I don't think it will ever be a tool for surveillance capitalism, which is a nice thing.
Lynn, what possibilities emerge from integrating Holochain and value flows and REA architectures?
Yeah, we're trying to do that now in several projects, which is pretty fun. But the coolest possibility to me is that Value Flows and REA provide a way to connect Holochain networks to each other. So we're getting networks of networks. And it can be networks that were formed and coordinated by people from the grassroots for their own benefit, And then before you know it, you have a whole economic ecosystem going, say for a community, say for a bioregion. So that's the kind of promise I feel with this kind of integration, which I think is very cool and we need it. I think so. I mean, and we could expand that. If Holochain had kind of a set of ontologies that were used in that way, you could internet work in whatever way you needed to. We're doing the economic work, but there's other stuff. There's social networking, there's governance, all kinds of things. So a lot of work to be done there. But that's what I think is an amazing possibility. Another thing maybe to mention here is that we can start thinking more about how to simplify software development, making it more modular, working towards that concept of the open app ecosystem that we talked about a little bit. For example, hREA is created in that vein where it REA-based backend, it's very generic and can be used by any developer who wants to create user interface software on top of that, which is by its nature kind of much more specific and will support all kinds of different user experiences and use cases. There is a lot of work we got to do to get to this goal, but I see the possibilities.
Lynn, could you share the story of the Carbon Farm Network?
Sure. The Carbon Farm Network is actually one of the projects that we're working on right now using Holochain and Value Flows, and it's built as a user interface on top of hREA, making use of that generic open source software that's sitting there for everybody. But the real story about the Carbon Farm Network, of course, is on the ground as usual. They are a textile network in the Hudson Valley region of New York that focuses on sustainable creation of knitted clothing, basically. They are organized as a cooperative of the designers, and the designers together manage that whole supply chain. The network also includes the farmers and the mills in between, where the fiber coming off the farms, this is alpaca and sheep farms, gets processed and made into yarn and knitted. They're a supply chain network, they like to call themselves, as opposed to just a supply chain.
Lynn, what problems are being solved by the Carbon Farm Network software?
Well, one thing is definitely sustainability. They see that as very important to them. Thus the term carbon farming, right? So Carbon Farm Network. So they support implementation of agricultural practices that tend to reduce carbon, sequester carbon, etc. And that also relates to them focusing on trying to be as local or regional as possible, which is sometimes difficult in this world, and educating people about that. So another thing just to say about them is that they're in between what you think about as artisanal kind of, people making things by hand and a mass industrial production. They're in between that kind of a batch manufacturing thing. But for example, there's nobody with knitting needles, there's knitting machines, right? But it's all local, smaller, and community-based, but also real.
Nice. Lynn, what are the main challenges ahead of the Carbon Farm Network software development?
They are many. So, I mean, the first one that comes to mind is funding, which is often the case with these grassroots efforts that aren't starting with capital in hand. And they have been doing a lot of work with the small farmers, right, on this carbon farming practice. A lot of that's funded by the USDA, but that just got yanked in our current political climate. So they're really scrambling there. The software effort has received funding both from Carbon Farm Network's contacts in the textile world and from several key people in the Holochain ecosystem, which is super helpful. And then the Carbon Farm Network itself, the designers pitch into some of their income to the regenerative work with the farmers that they are doing and some of the infrastructure work. So, but I think unfortunately in this world, we're not at a place where new local sustainable economic activity itself can fully fund these kind of extra efforts that are needed, especially at the startup for these for things that are trying to support a better climate and natural ecosystems and need new kinds of infrastructure that'll support these kinds of networks into the future. More generally, they have the ongoing kinds of challenges that are often felt by groups trying to implement this kind of local sustainable production of lasting quality in the world that we live in, right? The monopoly capitalism that's moved production to areas of cheap labor, exploits the environment, and privatizes the profits while socializing the costs. And all this makes artificially cheap prices possible. And that's a problem in this time of ever rising inequality. So there's this giant systemic problem that happens for all of these like next economy experiments, and they are definitely feeling that themselves. Just in the last few weeks, they learned, this is just an example, right? They learned of that their spinning mill is shutting down, and now they're really scrambling to find something not too far away that can spin yarn. You know, it's just part of this this level of deindustrialization that's happened, and somehow this spinning mill survived the worst of it, and then I think COVID did them in. But anyway, they're closing, which made all of us sort of immediately think, oh, is there some way that somebody or a co-op or anything of people can get together and take advantage of that equipment and plants sitting there to start something new, a new spinning mill there with all that existing equipment. But it's hard to scramble into that easily and quickly, but maybe.
Fingers crossed it will happen, and hopefully we'll be catching up soon and hear about the development there.
That would be good.
Lynn, I'm looking forward to more. Lynn, are there other value flows use cases you would like to share?
Yeah, sure, because it's such a flexible and lovely model. And I can say that because it stands on the shoulders of many. But there are lots of possibilities. A couple other apps that are in process now using hREA. One is an offers needs application being created for internal use in the Holochain ecosystem. So developers and projects and people who can offer other kinds of support can all find each other. And there are a bunch of other offers needs efforts in progress elsewhere. All kinds of exchange can be supported, conventional sales and e-commerce and purchases with money, whatever, mutual credit, gift economy, barter, whatever people can imagine if Value Flows doesn't support it, we'll make it support it, right? If it's something that people are using to try to make this a better situation. Another in progress application is a rewrite of the old Sensorica software. So that's like the next generation NRP, right? And it'd cover probably about the same scope, but I'm sure they've learned a lot over the years and we can make lots of improvements. And another thing I could mention there is that Sensorica has innovated with something we could call a contribution economy. And I see that actually a fair amount now. A lot of groups are very interested in this concept, where they distribute the income that comes in according to the contributions that were made to create the resources that brought that income in, right, when it was sold or delivered to somebody. Sensorica has what they call a benefit distribution algorithm or redistribution. I've seen it both ways, which is democratically decided. And they use that the software actually uses that to calculate how much all the contributors get from that income. And it can be pretty involved or not that involved, but that's a lot of people are interested in that. A couple other applications that I think deserve a mention are apps that were completed in the EU. One is called Reflow. It's circular economies, and they had like 6 pilot municipalities. So it was circular economy software within a city. And a more recent one is called Fab City, and that supports fab labs with individual or collaborative design, and then the distributed manufacturing of the fabricated items that were designed by whoever, because the designs are available and are open. There's also a Netherlands-based organization while we're in Europe here called the Weathermakers that is working on software to help them design and manage rather large projects, earth-moving projects often, that are to restore water cycles. And it's worth kind of emphasizing that Value Flows and REA, and we've actually had fairly recent discussions on this, have expanded the concepts both of resources and agents to make climate modeling and climate accounting a real thing, also to account for externalities, to account for carbon and nitrogen and whatever you need, right? And we think that's kind of important for a whole set of future projects. Like when you have an agent can be a person or an organization, but we want to say that an agent can also be a river or a forest, and that resources are taken out of that forest and resources are put into that forest. Maybe they're helpful and maybe they aren't. But anyway, if you can track all those flows, you can get a lot closer to helping the climate out a little bit, which we definitely need. We've also worked locally with a high school Fab Lab network, and there's a mutual aid network with us we've been working with for several years. I want to say it's not all about manufacturing, like services are equally well supported. When we were actually creating Value Flows, we talked quite a bit with guerrilla translators who translate, right? And the finished document is the resource that's created. So yeah, it's worth thinking about broadly. And also things like saving pools or other financial kinds of applications, It can be about anything of value to people that they want to track in some way. Yeah. On one, let me give you one more too, because this one's sort of important. And we did a couple projects around this, but it is important, I think, to understand that Value Flows and REA can represent any kind of aggregated data. It can be more than operational software. We did a couple projects around this. One was in Nova Scotia, mostly around planning around food, and then one specifically around fish, and then one with our nearby mutual aid network where they're trying to connect up people and organizations within the community. And this kind of software gets you to where you can plan, for one thing, but also you can discover where there are gaps and where a new organization might fill in a gap, or you can discover where one organization produces something that another organization uses, but they don't know about each other yet, you know? So it's all about using the same model and similar tools for regions or communities. So that I can get pretty excited about. Actually, we were just talking with some people from Asheville, and there's a whole effort there where they are thinking this is an area that was devastated by a hurricane a few months ago, and they're still rebuilding from that. But there's a whole group that's really interested in using that as an opportunity, even, you know, to think about, well, how would they restructure their economy in that region, you know, and just reconfigure things. So that's, I think, important.
I love the tack you're taking of looking into challenges as opportunities. We're going through an extremely challenging political moment in the world. And I'm really interested in what are the opportunities there, because like there's no point in us only loathing it, right? It's like what can be done, what are the possibilities that open up, how can we encounter it in strength rather than as victims. And I'm really interested in why is work like Value Flow so relevant to this?
Yeah, you talked about the challenges, and indeed they are many, right? I think anything where we can get prepared now and start to create relationships among ourselves, in this case, we're talking about economic activity and economic relationships, but in any area really of human interaction, right? You know, if we can start working towards something that we know will work better than what we've got, maybe we'll have it when we need it. I mean, I don't know, you know, value flows and this kind of work we're doing with these projects it's a, you know, we always say it's a small piece of a very large puzzle, and that's really true. There's so much that's needed. Um, but, you know, the open source piece is important. Um, and we're going to need that open knowledge to easily bring ourselves together, you know, up to where we need to be. And hopefully we'll still have internet. If we don't, we'll work with it. But, you know, but we kind of ended up with our little piece of the puzzle just because we happen to have those skills and experience. You know, there are so many pieces that need to be plugged into that it's sort of mind-boggling. But I think if we can get our collaboration hats on and not be too competitive about any of this will we can maybe make something happen in time. We'll see.
Yeah, I'm in love with small bits, you know. I think that in the beginning of my adult life, I had this expectation of scale, that things had to be big, they had to be impactful. And recently I heard from Paul Crafel that really at scale things are usually downward spirals because you're seeing them erode really quick. When you're building a small bit of the puzzle, you're laying bricks. You can imagine the cathedral or the beautiful bridge you're building, but it's not quick. Scale comes with the encounter of many small bits coming together. It's not immediate and as visible as downward spirals. And this was a beautiful framing for me, just like, yeah, it's all right to be doing this small bit of work here that's very meaningful and local, because it will connect to other ones, and together they will create an upward spiral. And yeah, this has been inspiring me a lot. And when I hear of your experience and the years you've dedicated to this, it goes like, yeah, there it is again, that's the pattern that works and that makes sense.
Yeah, well said. You have your puzzle piece too, right, Lucas?
Lynn, it's been a huge pleasure to have you here today and hear of your story and all the beautiful work you and Bob have been doing together. I really appreciate your time and really looking forward to meeting you again shortly and hearing of the development of both value flows and hREA and where carbon farm networks are going with the software you're creating. Loads of
Well,
gratitude.
and likewise, Lucas, this is important work you're doing here. And believe me, I wouldn't get up and talk about it without you initiating and doing what needs to be done to get what people are doing out there. So that's a good thing. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lynn. Have a beautiful day.
And you too.
Thanks for joining us at Entangled Futures. Subscribe to our channel for more conversations on mutuality towards a world that works for all.